timing, of course, of this event couldn't be better. We're running up into probably the most exciting presidential, we always say it's the most exciting presidential election for many decades, if not ever, but I think genuinely one of the, if not the most exciting presidential election in anybody's memory. And the stakes are extremely high, the issues very, very clearly drawn. And Anthony Gardner himself, of course, has played an important role in US government and politics over recent years. He was, for 3 years, the President Obama's nominee to be the US ambassador to the European Union. And under President Clinton, he served in the National Security Council, the Foreign Policy Advisory Service inside the White House. So he's seen the US executive branch at the very highest level. He's also worked in other governmental organizations. He worked for the Treuhand in Germany after German unification. He's worked in France for the Commission des Opérations des Bourses. He's had a distinguished business career. He's also had a quasi-academic career as well, both as a visiting professor at the European University Institute in Florence and also at Bruges College of Europe. Now, the book is in many ways a mixture of 3 different strands. It's a kind of personal memoir, Stars with Stripes, the essential partnership between the United States and the European Union. It's a memoir, therefore, of his own role and work in over many years in trying to build and maintain transatlantic relations. It's a policy primer in the sense that it takes us through a whole series of very specific areas of EU-US interaction. It goes into the interstices of this process in great detail and helps us understand the issues. And it's also, to some degree, a manifesto in the sense that it sets out ideas for the future and how to improve and maintain transatlantic relations at a time when they are under great pressure. So, Anthony, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to Klaus. I have really good memories of all my visits to the European Parliament. You know, I think I visited Strasbourg 8 or 9 times during my 3 years. And I did so because, first of all, I love Strasbourg, but the more important reason perhaps is that I really valued the European Parliament's contribution to US-EU relations. And we had some really important topics that we had to sort out. One of them, of course, was our trade relationship, over which, of course, the Parliament plays a very important role, and also data privacy, in which the Parliament played an important role. So I was there principally for those 2 reasons, but also for others. And I met with most, not all, but most of the groups. We had organized with my wife many dinners with different, national groupings, and then different parties and so forth, and I really enjoyed it. So, of course, I left my post, Anthony, in January 2017. We were all asked to leave on the day that Donald Trump took office. I was actually, happy to do so, although it was a breach of precedent in which most ambassadors would stay on a few months to say proper goodbyes. But I went, as you mentioned, to the College of Europe, had a wonderful 4 months, and then I went to the European University Institute and had a wonderful 6 months, and I started plotting this book. Why did I do it? I, didn't really want to write a book, frankly, but when I saw the damage that was being done, and I knew there was going to be a lot of damage over the 3.5 years, I didn't know how much, but I knew there was going to be damage. I thought to myself, well, somebody should try to articulate in a non-academic way what the United States and the European Union actually do together. There are a lot of great academic books, which is why I say non-academic, and I knew I couldn't compete with that. But I thought somebody, and I soon concluded it would be me, should try to describe what we do. So indeed, you're right. The book is a mixture of several things. I try to describe in a number of areas, which are divided into 3 different buckets. The first really is the trade relationship. And that is indeed the bulk of where we interact, not just trade in Ttip, of course, but how we cooperate at WTO and in multilateral and plurilateral trade negotiations. The data privacy, I talk about at some length, and how we struggle to try to, we put in place, obviously, Privacy Shield after Safe Harbor was invalidated. Now we're back at the starting gates, and somebody's going to have to look at this agreement and see how we can save that. And then I have a chapter on digital, which I was quite involved in, and I think it remains an essential part of this dialogue where we should be working very much closely, especially as the EU drafts its Digital Services Act and revises the e-commerce directive. The second bucket, which was a bit of a surprise for me, Anthony, but, I had studied the EU for a long time, strange American in a way. I got interested in the EU at law school in 1990. I studied EU law. I practiced law in Brussels. I was an intern at DG Comp. But I still was rather surprised that the second bucket of security issues were more important than I had expected. And by security issues, I include, and I write about sanctions, law enforcement, and this was a surprise to me. I went to Europol 3 times and got briefings, detailed briefings about what we do on combating serious crime and counterterrorism. Very relevant, obviously, in the wake of what happened during my time in Brussels. Energy security as well, which was a rich area of dialogue between the US and the EU, where we made important steps in terms of diversification of energy sources and supply routes, and military and security. And this makes some people rather surprised, especially in the United States. It was more relevant than I thought. I had assumed that this was not going to be a big topic, but I was particularly surprised that some of our 4-star generals in the United States, particularly the head of AFRICOM, our combatant command for Africa, would visit me fairly regularly and say the EU's contributions in this area are actually important. Not because there are a lot of boots on the ground or because the spending on these missions are that high, but because they are actually doing important work in areas where the United States either doesn't have the will or the capacity to do so. And I mentioned, I would include rather in the Horn of Africa and in Mali and in Niger and in other places. And then finally, the third part of the book is about saving the planet. And there I would include dealing with climate change. And that really is a powerful story. It was a news story for me in large part. I was extremely marginal player in this. It was all being handled out of Washington, so I was a spectator. But I did some research, and I was really interested to see how over decades the US and the EU had been out of sync. Interestingly, in the 70s, the US was actually on the forefront on some issues, particularly on the ozone layer. And then, of course, we had the Bush years, and the EU became much more in the front on environmental issues and global warming. And then we finally, fast forward to the Obama years, we had 8 years in which the US and the EU were largely in sync. And it was thanks to the US-EU co-leadership of this topic that we got a success in Paris after frankly, the failure, disappointment in Copenhagen. And now, of course, in the Trump administration, which makes his story so desperately sad, is that we've lost essentially 4 years. The EU has done yeoman's work in keeping alive this agreement and setting very ambitious goals for reduction in emissions. The last part in the book of Saving the Planet is foreign aid and humanitarian assistance, which I had known about, but certainly learned much more about during my time in Brussels. The good work that the EU does, including, in addition to the member states on both topics. I lived through the Ebola crisis and saw how we cooperated very well together, belatedly, but very well and effectively in dealing with the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. And, it's interesting, Anthony, because I did a bit of archaeological digging, because I had indeed, as you said, been in the White House in 1994-95 and helped draft the document called the New Transatlantic Agenda, which now is rather dated. But if you look at it, even back in 1995, we had identified a global pandemic working group, to identify the risks of global pandemics and to help us prepare for them in many ways. So whether it was research in setting up a protocol for how we would respond and so forth. And very little was actually done about it. It was a dead letter for many years. And then in 95, we actually did cooperate effectively. And I mention this because in this current outbreak, we've seen very little, in fact, no desire of the current Trump administration to cooperate on a multilateral basis, whether it's with the EU, with other countries in dealing with this crisis and preventing further outbreaks. So that's the book. I haven't mentioned, well, one big thing is obviously Brexit. So I have a chapter on Brexit where I don't hold my punches. I frankly struggled with this, Anthony, because I said, do I really want to write what I want to write? And I finally decided, yes, I'm going to say it. We did a lot of work in the final months of the administration as to what we thought Brexit would mean for the United States, for Europe, and for the UK. And the conclusion was it would be bad news on all three fronts, but we focused on what it would mean for the United States, obviously, because the UK took a sovereign decision and will live with that decision. There are many reasons for this, but the key reason, I don't think will surprise anybody, is that the UK and the US had been so philosophically aligned, and having the UK in the tent of the EU in a bigger, broader, more influential grouping, we thought was an important, important fact and help us to achieve some of our goals. I was frequently on the phone and cooperating with my good friend Ivan Rogers, who was then Perm Rep of the UK. But it wasn't just philosophical alignment on issues like free trade and transatlanticism and Russia and so on. It was the fact that we think that the UK has made such a contribution to the creation of the European Union, and I think most EU countries would agree that losing it is a real shame. And I think what we wrote in those papers is proving to be the case, that it will be bad for all three, UK, US, and EU. This vision is so different from this administration's view that in the triangle of relationships, US, UK, UK, EU, and EU, US, the only one that matters, essentially, is the US, UK one. That is a fundamental misreading of reality. I think the Biden administration believes strongly that all three sides of that triangle have to work well together. So writing this book was essentially a form of cheap therapy, Anthony. Rather than gnashing my teeth every day, I thought I should, as you said, write not only an analysis of what we have done, but importantly, what we could do still together. Now, it depends on what will happen on November 3rd. I joined the campaign the first day. I've known the candidate for a long time. I'm a big admirer of his. Obviously, I thought he was the right candidate, and luckily that's what happened. I don't speak for the campaign. Obviously, I should say that I do not speak for the campaign, but I am running a couple of the working groups, not surprisingly, the one on the EU, and contributing a lot to the one in Western Europe and on trade. A lot of work is going on, and it's been going on for 6 months now. We have papers, and I'm not revealing any secrets. You would imagine this is happening. We have papers about what we should do if we win on day one, what we should do in the first 100 days, what we should do in the first year. And there are two things I want to mention here that are important. There are two clarifying thoughts that are informing our work. The first is that we have to focus on what is doable and practical, i.e. be very pragmatic, because as you know, in our system, it takes months for people to get on the ground in terms of getting a new team focused. And then we have these midterms. So essentially we have less than 2 years, potentially, maybe a year and a half. So we really are thinking in these working papers, what can we do to make progress between the US and the EU in a short period of time that's meaningful? The second very important concept is, how do we prove that we can pursue a foreign policy for the middle class, particularly in trade, obviously, but not only in trade. And even a broader concept is, how can we prove to our own citizens and to the world that following the rules, respecting institutions, respecting the multilateral rules-based order yields better results than unilateralist policies of destroying institutions, destroying rules, and bullying and harassing your allies, which is what I would describe this administration's policies have been regarding the EU. That's going to be so important, because if we fail in that core mission, I really worry, even if we win November 3rd, we will face perhaps an even more virulent form of populism in 4 years' time. So a lot of our papers that we're writing, and I can, I don't want to take more time, but a thing I'm confident there are a lot of things we can do quickly together. And I've written a couple of these papers on trade. I think we can eliminate tariffs on industrial goods trade quickly. I think we can move quickly to resolve the Boeing Airbus dispute. We would lift the ridiculous steel and aluminum tariffs that were imposed unilaterally, and the EU would lift its own sanctions. We can reconstitute the WTO dispute settlement body, i.e. lift the veto and make it function properly. We should relaunch some of the trade negotiations that we have been co-sponsoring, like the Environmental Goods Agreement. We should re-engage the OECD on the digital taxation negotiations. And we should, in my view, set up a working group right away to come up with proposals about how to reform the WTO and deal with Chinese unfair trading practices. And there are a lot of other topics that I think are doable in the short term. In terms of non-trade, and here I'll end, I think I would expect, I would hope, I believe that a new administration would immediately announce its support for the Paris Climate Accords. You've seen his speeches in this regard. We've made some very ambitious statements about how we want to decarbonize as well and launch a massive investment program in renewable energy. I would hope to see an immediate reaffirmation of NATO's centrality to transatlantic defense. I would expect that we would try to save, to the extent that we can, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear agreement. I would like to see us establish a task force on infectious diseases. I would like us to work more closely together on countering propaganda and election interference, where we both face very similar challenges. Continue to work on energy independence, although in a different way. We can talk about Nord Stream maybe later, but not by harassing and bullying our allies like Germany, but continue to work on diversification of sources and supply routes. I would like us to negotiate a deal on the exchange of electronic evidence for law enforcement. Very important. We can get into that. I've looked into this. Similar to the deal that we struck with the UK, very important for dealing with serious crime and terrorism. And we're going to have to deal with Privacy Shield's future. Not an easy thing to do, given the judgment that we've all read. And I finally, working very closely on digital economy issues and also on good governance, anti-corruption, and the rule of law, all topics that this administration really has ignored, and I think they're extremely important. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, a lot that we can do together. I've spent 29 years of my life professionally, more or less looking at the various parts of the EU. I'm a believer. The book makes it clear I'm a believer. With all of its warts, with all of its faults, and we can make long lists of them, I believe the EU is stated in the title of this book, is the essential partner of the United States on many of the goals that we share. Why don't I end there?
Anthony, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful tour d'horizon, setting out the issues, but also the way forward in many ways. And that's really a fascinating part of this book. As I mentioned earlier, it deals really with the substance, the nitty-gritty detail of so many aspects of EU-US relations, and therefore provides the potential for a roadmap forward. I had the experience of working during the Clinton administration, which was very much this kind of unipolar moment. How different did it feel when you came back those years later to work with Obama?
Different. One of my favorite anecdotes, which I repeat in the book, and I repeated many times in Brussels, is that when I showed up as a young staffer at the NSC in October of '94, I had just come from Brussels. I was already, bitten by the EU bug, and said I wanted to focus on EU issues. And the answer I got from the senior director for Europe was, "That's great because no one else in this building cares about that stuff." And it was a bit true, well, slightly an exaggeration, but it was a bit true. And I remember trying to bring together those in the administration back then, Clinton 94, who were really following EU issues and the Maastricht Treaty and so on. And we could muster about 30, let's say, and we would meet occasionally. So it was a fringe issue. EU was considered significant in trade for sure, but not a big topic. Fast forward to the Obama years, so many people would show up on our video conference calls, Anthony, on data privacy, on digital, on trade, and on energy security. The audience had just burgeoned. Now, admittedly, some of these topics like safe harbor touched a lot of our core interests. So we had sometimes 50 people on interagency calls. So the mood was completely different. Many people understood, decades later, that the EU really was a relevant core actor on a much more, a much broader set of issues. So quite different.
We've already got one question that's come in online, and it's a very specific question, so I'm going to put it to you straight away from Anne van Heist. Incidentally, we've got 138 people online at the moment. And Anne asks, with regard to digital policy specifically, do you think that the US and the EU have sufficient fora to work on these together? And also, what role do you see for digital trade? And what do you perceive as the most pressing barriers? That's a big area, but it's one that's extremely topical. So, Anthony, what's your perspective on the potential for digital cooperation?
We certainly were talking about this a lot at many different levels, government and non-governmental. I mean, there's certainly privacy practitioners and digital practitioners, but also in government, we had the National Economic Council. We had at state people whose job it was to deal sort of on an international basis or cooperate with countries and groupings like the EU. So I think we have the fora necessary to do it. And as I mentioned before, I think it is incredibly important that we do so for the simple reason that we have a new administration coming in. I think in Congress, the views have now evolved significantly. The last 4 years, the EU is de facto the sole regulator of Silicon Valley. And it's not meant as a criticism. I think that the EU has just been more serious and more proactive in thinking about issues, everything from liability of online platforms to see whether we should adjust the type of liability the platform should assume, to copyright. And of course, the copyright directive was passed, to the treatment of hate speech or harmful content online. First effort was obviously to have the industry regulate itself, and now I'm moving to regulate the industry because there's more that can and should be done. But even beyond that, I think we both together need to think thoroughly about the power and the influence, both economic and political, that some of these companies are now achieving. Whether they should be treated as de facto utilities that provide power and light to our homes. They've become basically essential. And also to rethink the issues of what has happened to our media. I think we do have a common interest in protecting quality print media and audio media, television media. And in a world where the vast bulk of advertising is captured by online platforms, and certainly the print media has suffered in large part because of that, we have to think through really all of the consequences of the business model of some of these platforms in which we are the product, in which we are being sold and we are being monetized. And that has a lot of different aspects to this. I think taxation is just one of them, but certainly liability is another. And the proper balance between content creators and those who use content. in many different areas. No, there are no easy answers to this, but I don't think I don't think we've gotten the balance right in the United States. I think the EU has given us certainly a lot to think about in the way it has drawn those lines. Um, on digital trade, absolutely. I mentioned, I think in passing, that TTIP was too ambitious. I think it was too ambitious. I think we can scale it down. But even in a smaller deal, we need absolutely to have principles of digital trade as a core part of it. And we had it in TPP. I think we have it actually USMCA. We should even go further in a US EU deal based around the principles now well known in the United States called the Digital 2 Dozen. You still can find online that we published during the Obama administration, of core principles that we would want to see protected in a trade deal and globally, because we are the logical partners to ensure that our standards, our values regarding the digital economy actually become the standards and values worldwide.
Well, that leads me, if I may, to directly on from what you've just said, Anthony, to another question, which has been certainly arousing my interest. You'll have doubtless come across the book that was recently published by Anu Bradford at Columbia University, in which there it is. Yeah, we had her actually do our. I think it may well have been our last book talk just before the summer holidays, and one of the points that she made was. Though it wasn't right up front in her analysis, was that the US had kind of abdicated its role in regulatory policymaking, and the kind of vacuum had emerged. If you went back to the 60s, 70s, maybe even the 80s, the US was essentially setting global standards. But as a combination of Reaganism and deregulation and then gridlock, essentially the US system became much less good at generating that. Do you see the potential for the United States to reassert itself in that field? And the other question which bears on that is many of these more technical areas which you describe in your book, do you think they are now going to be weaponized and politicized going forwards? So that a bit like trade policy, general trade policy has been, so that whereas trade policy was the area for the technocrats and the experts 20 or 30 years ago, now it's highly political. Are we going to find that in more and more areas, which actually will make regulatory cooperation over time more difficult?
Well, look, under Donald Trump, the answer is yes. I mean, we've seen some extraordinary stuff. Who would have thought, even a few years ago, that a president of the United States would directly intervene in a business deal to ensure that the transaction goes to a friend of his who supported his campaign, which has happened in the ByteDance TikTok, or who would politicize decisions, for example, against Germany, saying, well, I don't like Chancellor Merkel, so I will threaten her with car tariffs, or I will withdraw troops from Germany because in a fit of pique against the German chancellor, because I don't think Germans are doing enough to they're selling too many cars in the United States and they don't buy enough of our cars. This is an absurd direction. Of course, it's an absurd direction. And when we threaten or actually apply unilateral sanctions by invoking national security exemptions on a willy-nilly basis on spurious arguments that aluminum and steel imports from allies at a time of peace represent a threat, I mean, that is the way of the jungle. That is the way of the jungle. And not surprisingly, other countries have taken a page out of our book, from Saudi Arabia to Russia. And these cases have now gone to the WTO, and luckily they've lost. And they've very clearly said that national security exemption is not a free pass. You can't politicize this. You actually have to prove it. You have to prove that there is a national security threat. And Saudi Arabia failed to do it because it was, in that case, it was a clear actions against to put an embargo against Bahrain. And Russia failed in its efforts, at least on the law, in terms of the measures it took against Ukraine. But we have to go back, and I think Biden will take us back to a context of respecting the rules and the institutions that we built together. And you've seen how Congress has changed back to digital, that there is now a real interest in saying the United States needs to look at some of this legislation like the Digital Millennium Corporation Act, DMCA, that has struck a deal a long time ago, there's now considered perhaps a deal, by that I mean the balance, that's not appropriate given what has happened in the digital economy. So yes, I think we will now, assuming Biden wins, we can be interacting on these core issues. So we should not be politicizing these issues. We should be looking at them as co-regulators. The EU, and this is the last thing I'll say. Hello, Klaus. Good to see you. The argument I make to American teens is that the EU is a superpower. It is a superpower in trade and as a regulator. And those are two things that shouldn't be underestimated. And all I can say, I have fond memories, by the way, of Klaus and meeting with you in your office in Brussels, and always impressed at how you had this vision of where you wanted to take the European Parliament. In many ways, including, by the way, the creation of the European Parliamentary Research Service and how the U.S. Congress is structured. And I remember you showed me these trains leaving the station, legislative trains leaving the station, increasing the transparency for people to understand what the Parliament is doing. So anyway, great to see you.
Thank you, Anthony. Over to you, Klaus.
Anthony, great to see you, both Anthonys, by the way. And fantastic moment to have this conversation because so much is at stake in just a couple of weeks. So if I can misuse this opportunity to raise a number of questions, which I'm very interested in. The first one is, I think many people believe when they look at Trump, this is a kind of exception, historical accident, and so on. But the question is, does he also represent maybe new historical necessities, or is it just an accident? And when I say this, I would like to make reference at two things. The first is, traditionally, the United States looked at Eurasia, of course with values, but also in terms of geopolitics. So obviously the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The major new challenge now is China. So to a certain extent, it could be argued that this has been understood, but it was also understood by the Obama administration, but in different ways. But in how far will this impact future policies, both on China, on Russia, and maybe on the EU? And the second question, when we look back in history, we have seen that very often after decades of liberalization, very liberal regimes and economic exchange rules, like, for example, the 19th century, we were having backlashes, like, unfortunately, let's say in the earlier 20th century, because also maybe people didn't feel their interest very well covered. Some people did, but other people didn't, and therefore created a base for different policies. So that's a bit my question. I mean, if there is a presidential change, is there something that nevertheless will have to continue? It seems difficult to imagine, but I know when I'm in Washington, people have explained to me that the first presidency of the new president is normally like the second presidency of the outgoing president. I think in this case we can exclude it, but nevertheless, are there some continuity lines which nevertheless you would see? And one issue could be China, because China itself has changed its approach very much. Has become much more aggressive towards its neighbors and much more outspoken about its global ambitions. And the second is how to protect the more vulnerable in societies, because obviously these were the people around the big lakes which gave Trump the decisive votes. And there needs to be an offer for them as well. You've alluded to this already a little bit earlier. But these are the two questions which I would have, and where my own suspicion would be that something, in fact, will change as well for new democratic administration on China and how we protect these more vulnerable groups in society.
Wow. Well, those are huge questions, and I think the campaign is thinking about them. Let's take the case of, the vulnerable in society. For whatever one can say about Donald Trump, he is a genius in one sense. He identified this frustration, not just among his core or super marginalized voters, but a very broad base of electors of voters who felt deeply dissatisfied with the current system. And he managed to tap into it in a way that very few others really understood. And it's there. I think, I'm biased, of course, but I think that his recipe makes the disease much worse. The income inequality we're seeing in the United States, the stagnation of middle-class wages, that's going to be worse. Even the trade deficit, which is not the best metric of success, is worse. So that's the great irony. And yet his supporters think that he is on their side. Why do I say this? I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, we have to show, and the Biden administration is focusing in the papers we're writing, that the foreign policy, particularly trade, can work better for the middle class and to show results, real results. And that our way, quote unquote, together with the EU, our way of respecting rules and respecting institutions yields better results, including with regard to China. And you're right, China is one point of probably of continuity to a certain extent. I look back on the days of the Soviet-US conflict in the Cold War, and I remember even then, Klaus, you'll remember, there were hawks and there were doves. Yeah. Even then, together, there are no doves on China, barely exist. We're almost, unanimous in our view that China is the main threat, and the direction of travel, both domestically and you mentioned it in terms of their, policies abroad, are dangerous. The absence of a debate on China in the United States is slightly concerning, because you would always like to see some debate. But I think you're right that in Congress and amongst the American people, there are very few differences between Democrats and Republicans. However, the tactics will be different, for sure. The tactics will be very different. And get back to my earlier comment, we need to show that working with allies and working within the rules, we can do better in terms of reforming the WTO and getting China to reform its unfair trading practices than we can by bullying and threatening and imposing unilateral tariffs and by making the WTO system crash. I mean, it's as simple as that. And there are no easy answers here. But as I mentioned at the beginning, if we fail to show that in 4 years of a Biden administration, I think you're right. We're going to see this Trumpism return, perhaps even stronger and more vicious, because people will say, well, the lesson we've learned is that we have to be even more aggressive and even more unilateral and stop working with our allies because they're a distraction. What I would like to see, as I mentioned, for the first 100 days, and certainly in the first year, the U.S. and the EU, to set up groups where we together leverage our joint power, economic power and political power, to force change, particularly with China. And I think we need to show that to convince the skeptics.
Maybe if I could complement that a little bit, I start to slowly become a veteran, which you can also identify with my hairstyle, you see. Which means that I increasingly make reference to past times, including the last century. So I remember that in the 80s, everybody was absolutely convinced that we were an alliance of democracies, and that democracy was really mattering, that this was the dividing line, in fact. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we forgot a little bit about it. Economic opportunities maybe became more important, especially also in the relationship with China. And also, let's say, over the last couple of years, the feeling that democracies have to work closely naturally has, let's say, not been strengthened. But if we were to think that one of the big challenges is, in fact, China, and also, let's say, the regime they practice, do you think there is, let's say, there could be again something under the motto of alliance of democracies? And if that would be the case, What about India, for example? I mean, we see India quite similar to the European Union sometimes. So we have 24 languages, they have 25 languages, their states are quite strong. They have huge difficulties, but they maintain a functioning democracy on a continental scale. In fact, in Parliament, we started 4 or 5 years ago quite a substantial exchange programs on staffer level with India, both directions, which was taken up by the Indians with quite some interest. So, how do you look at India if China is becoming more of a challenge?
I'm not exactly very optimistic about what you're saying. Just today's news about what they've done with regard to Amnesty International doesn't fill me with great confidence. And this is part of a long list of actions they've taken against international organizations who dare to criticize, the Indian regime's various decisions with regard to pluralism and religious tolerance and so on. So I'm not sure I'm very confident, nor would I be very confident to identify Turkey, which after all is still a functioning democracy. But we know what's happening in Turkey doesn't exactly fill me with great confidence. It's continuing to go in a direction of authoritarian rule, where I really worry about the future of any free press or free judiciary, which may disappear even in the next few years. So the concept, I think, is a problematic one. I think we need to, and I get back always to the US-EU angle here, even though the EU contains several member states that are falling far short of required behavior enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. But I see the US and the EU together with Canada and others to fight for and reestablish some of the values that we were talking about. And indeed, by the way, Biden has called for a summit of the democracies in the first 100 days of his office. I frankly don't know what that would mean and look like, but he is passionate about doing it and making, as I mentioned, both democracy and good governance and anti-corruption, transparency, core principles of his administration.
Thank you very much. By the way, we all still very vividly remember the visit of Joe Biden to the European Parliament and his speech which he gave, and also the very friendly and gentle conversations he had with our Conference of Presidents. And in fact, he was ready for a photo opportunity with everybody, including us poor staffers. So maybe we have already a joint photo with the next president of the United States. Who knows?
Thank you very much indeed, Charles. Thank you, Anthony. Right, now we've got 146 people online at the moment, and questions are pouring in. I'm just going to group them together a little bit to facilitate things, and I'd like to take a couple of questions that have come in. One has come in from Eleni Lazarou, who works in the European Parliamentary Research Service, and another from James Ellis, who you know very well, former MEP and co-chair of the Transatlantic Policy Network. And they both really ask about the same thing, which is they pick up on your reference to your work on the new transatlantic agenda in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, rather, and they ask, I mean, how far could the reference which exists there and the work that was done to strengthen interparliamentary dialogue, with the transatlantic legislators dialogue being one of the things that came out of that, how could that be revived going forward? I mean, what is the parliamentary dimension, do you think, to trying to build stronger and more effective EU-US links in the coming years?
Well, Klaus is the expert here. You know, we did think about this, and I know James Ellis is very involved in this, and TPN has played such an important role in this. And I'm a big believer in legislative dialogue, but I have to tell you that after writing this paper and trying to find ways to deepen these relations, I sort of gave up, and I'll tell you why. I gave up is we're not set up, I think, to make this a success today. Part of it is on our side, part of it is on your side. On the European Parliament side, as I understood it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the participants in these dialogues often aren't the right ones. because they have to represent certain parties or certain, I'm not sure countries, but certain parties. And so the wrong people were at the table. And I was there at, I think, 3 or 4 of these discussions, right? And the view was, we're talking about the wrong things and the wrong people are at the table. That's only partly an explanation why not many congressmen and women would show up, typically, even when they were in the United States, because they didn't really see why should we be talking to the European Parliament about some foreign policy issues that the European Parliament really has a minor impact on. And we never succeeded with the Senate for, I guess, historical reasons. But the core problem is, if we really had to make this a serious effort, in my view, we would have to ensure that the discussions only focus on topics where the European Parliament clearly is competent, and in areas where the US congressperson will understand why he's having a conversation with a European parliamentarian. Data privacy and trade are clearly 2 of them, but there could be others. It could be sanctions and so forth. That's my view. I think it's a lost opportunity. Those conversations were not particularly value added, to be blunt. I think they could be. But we need to change things.
Thank you for that very frank answer, and one I think a lot of people will be able to relate to. I mean, of course, as you already hint, in many of the areas which you cover in your book, the power of the European Parliament has grown quite substantially in recent decades. So the ability to dock, if you like, the 2 systems should potentially be stronger than it was in the past. Now, going on to other colleagues who have asked questions, Alex Stutzman, who is Alex Stutzman, who's working with the European Parliament, is on secondment to the UN General Assembly at the moment. He says, it's always a delight to listen to Tony Gardner, and I'm looking forward to reading his book. Tackling global challenges efficiently requires better multilateralism, including at the United Nations. Will and how can the EU and the US again be strong joint pillars for multilateral action in that forum? So how do you see the UN dimension, if you like, of the EU and US working together?
Oh, look, Alexander, first of all, hi, wonderful to see you. We saw each other in Florence many times when I was there. It's great you're in New York. This is beyond my competence, although, I did see some evidence of this when I was at Post, for example, on something I recount in my book, actually. It's the Convention for the Protection of Endangered Species. I think it's CITES, right? But that's probably one of many examples where on environmental protection, where the UN does wonderful and important things, the US and the EU actually can essentially determine a deal that others will follow. So I would like that model to be rolled out wherever possible. Climate change is certainly a core area. Environmental protection is a core area, but it's beyond my. I'll leave it at that because I just don't know enough. Let me just add one thing, if I could, Anthony, to the prior question, where I have more direct experience. Part of the reason why congressmen and women were slightly skeptical about dealing with European parliamentarians is that some of them believe that the European Parliament is not really a parliament, because it doesn't have taxing powers and it can't actually, propose legislation in the way that the U.S. Congress does. And it required me to explain at great length that the European Parliament actually is a very significant participant in legislation. But that's the image that they have.
I mean, one way, of course, I take the point fully. One way of trying to overcome that is to explain we're both working in different forms of federal system. And the European Parliament, like the US Congress, is not controlled by a government. And therefore, parliamentarians are much more, what the French would say, électron libre. I mean, they're much more freestanding individuals, organized by party group and reflecting national interest and so on. But they are ultimately, you're in an environment where you have to put together a coalition. There's no majority in the European Parliament for any particular political force. And that means you're in a very, very strong parliamentary structure. And I think when one talks to politicians like that, they kind of pick up on it a bit. Now, we've got a lot of other questions that, as I say, are flowing in. I'm just going to take two or three sequentially. Yanis asked the following question. He says, it's quite difficult from a European perspective to fully comprehend the reasons behind the shift in US policy on so many fronts since Donald Trump became president, and in so many cases hurting American interests. Any thoughts of the reasons behind why this shift has been occurring? I know that takes you back to the issue that you were alluding to at the start, but I think it's a very important issue, particularly in the context of the election. And Hugo Pinto asks a question which is not far removed from that, where he says, you've mentioned that if we're not careful, in 2 or 4 years' time, we could see a comeback of an even stronger brand of national populism. How do you think we can best prevent that from happening? So, the populist temptation.
Well, yeah, indeed. Look, the tendency among this group, this demographic group that voted for Trump and could do so again, is, I think, as follows. The United States has the power; it just needs the will to change the world in its image. You know, and Trump has enunciated this new policy is basically that every country should be aggressively nationalist and pursue its own policies, and multilateralism is for the birds. And in fact, multilateralism serves as a pair of handcuffs, particularly for strong countries like the United States. So why should we be working in that context when we can do more, when we're unshackled? That's very much the view. And the view is, as I mentioned before, the EU is worse than a distraction. It shackles us. The UN shackles us. These rules, WTO, shackle us. Let's just liberate ourselves, right? And we can go free and get more stuff done. Now, 4 years is not a very long time to judge, but I think we've already seen that that policy just fails. But what we need to do, I think the reality shows it, but what we need to do is explain in clear messages to the American people that that policy hasn't yielded fruits. Now, we have to be very clear and pragmatic. The role of our politicians and even our diplomats is to promote our nation's interests. And when I was at Post, I felt we should be promoting the interests of the United States. So the acid test is, are Donald Trump's policies actually promoting U.S. interests? I say clearly not, but many of his supporters think yes, because there's still the difference between the image and the reality. The image is the tough words, the vulgarity, and the lecturing and the hectoring and so on. People like that. But I do believe that over time, the reality will catch up and people will see that it isn't achieving the benefits. The trouble is, I hope we don't have to spend another 4 years of Donald Trump to learn that lesson. I mean, this is the real fear. Because if we have another 4 years, we lose 4 years on climate change. We have another 4 years in which U.S. democratic checks and balances are weakened, potentially very seriously. In terms of judiciary, we're seeing it now. In terms of the media and so forth. But that is what is informing this campaign under Joe Biden. And if he wins, we have to show in clear messages to the blue-collar voters that the different way is better. So that's what I meant by saying if we're not careful, we'll get even a more virulent form of nationalist, aggressive policies in the United States. And I say this very sadly here, Anthony. You know, when I was growing up, I never thought that the problems we were facing in the United States would be something that we would see. I read about these problems in textbooks about other countries, whether it's underdeveloped countries or World War II and so forth, what happened to Weimar Germany. I never thought this is something that would be relevant to us in the United States. And yet here we are. It's relevant to us. Hopefully it will be a wake-up call and we can rebuild.
Thank you for that. Another question that's come is from Michela Del Monte, who really asks, how big are the stakes of the Supreme Court nomination battle that's about to occur? And are there implications for the shifting balance in the Supreme Court for transatlantic relations in the future?
Well, that's rather interesting. I mean, on transatlantic relations, I struggle to see a direct impact. It certainly, obviously, is an enormous impact on many core things in the United States, issues that have divided Americans from each other, whether it's abortion or gun rights, and many other topics. And if he does succeed, and he will pass this appointment, and if he wins the second term, he could even consolidate an advantage for very conservative justices on that court for a generation. So a huge impact. It has certainly motivated the Democratic base. It also has motivated the Republican base. But on transatlantic issues, I really struggle to see a direct impact. Having said that, Justice Breyer interestingly wrote a book, which I would recommend, about how he thought the United States, including into the Supreme Court, should consider as relevant international law and international practice. And he was, I think, joined in that view by several other justices. I think Justice Ginsburg was one of them, and Sotomayor. So it's a rather interesting trend. And you saw it in a lot of their judgments, certainly in his opinions, references, including to the EU, including to EU law and to international law in a way that you hadn't seen before.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Then there have been a number of comments on Brexit, and I'd just like to, if I may, quote something from your book. You have, as you probably recall, a series of photographs of yourself with major European and American leaders. Most of them are presidents, prime ministers, heads of state or government. But the only one who at the time wasn't who features is with Boris Johnson when he was foreign secretary, when he was visiting Brussels, I think. And in November 2016, so soon after the Brexit vote, you quote him as saying, "It will be bloody brilliant. Trump's victory is a huge opportunity for Britain. Like Brexit, it's all about taking back control." And you comment at the end of the section on Brexit there, you quote from Voltaire's Candide, when asked, "What is optimism?" Candide replies, "Alas, it is the madness of maintaining that everything is right when it is wrong," which I think is a beautifully apt quotation. But Adam Isaacs asked the question, how would you recommend that the US might resist attempts from the UK to co-opt America into its disagreements, that's Britain's disagreements, with the European Union, particularly over the Irish border? And that raises a much bigger question, which is, in a way, how do you see the Anglo-US kind of relationship in the context of the US-EU relationship, and how best to get that balance right in the years ahead?
Well, this is an area where there is a complete difference of view, total difference of view between the Trump and an eventual Biden administration. I mentioned earlier, I think the three sides of the triangle have to be equally strong. It's not just US, UK. So you saw what Nancy Pelosi said about the free trade agreement. She's been consistent about that. You saw what Biden himself said. I had suggested similar words also to Tony Blinken. I think we should have been perhaps even more robust in saying that if the UK continues to take its current line, which raises the risk of the reemergence of a frontier, we shouldn't even negotiate a free trade deal with the UK. The views are clear. It's not just because there's an Irish lobby in the United States. It's not true. The UK tabloids love to point to that fact. But I think there is a broad-based concern that those Good Friday Accords need to be protected, and we have skin in the game. We help to make them come about. Now, having said that, as I said, I think that Brexit has shown itself to be a mistake economically and politically. The UK will discover soon, if it hasn't already, that the world is a rather cold and forbidding place when it's outside the tent called the EU. But it's water under the bridge. It's water under the bridge. It's going to happen, and I think we need to make sure that the damage is minimized and the UK emerges from this in as good a place as possible. I think the United States has a core interest to make sure that that happens. Do I think we should negotiate a free trade deal with the UK? Yes, if the prior condition I mentioned is respected, and I think a deal can be done. I never believed for a moment that it was oven ready, that it was going to be hugely ambitious or economically significant, because it won't be. But there's a lot that we can get done, and probably simpler to get done with the UK than with the EU. I think that we will continue to work very closely with the UK on law enforcement, on sanctions, and on a host of issues where we are philosophically aligned. Now, this is what's so crazy, Anthony. Boris Johnson and some of the members of his cabinet have gotten into their heads that the UK is a convenient bedfellow with Donald Trump. But in fact, it's the opposite. If you really look at the UK's core interests, I mentioned a few: free trade. Donald Trump doesn't believe in, he believes in managed trade. If you look at Russia and the views of the UK on Russia, or on climate change, where this president thinks it's a hoax, the list is long. The UK's views are dramatically different from the views of this president. But he has believed that this man is kind of a Brexiteer in terms of, well, we just need to break free from the shackles of these rules. The trouble is, a lot of the rules are rules that Boris believes in, like multilateralism, the WTO. So it's kind of a contradiction here. He is clearly taking a page, by the way, out of Donald Trump's book in his negotiation style with the EU. He believes, I think, in constructive chaos. And the theory of constructive chaos is you throw all the cards up in the air, put your opponent on the back foot, and that's when you negotiate better. But what he hasn't understood, and what I told him actually face to face when I last saw him, is you have not understood the European Union. That's not the way the European Union can function or how it works well. You've just simply, as we've now seen, gotten the backup, and the reaction from the parliament's clear, the member states are clear. But close that parenthesis. I think that we need to work closely in ensuring strong relations with the EU and with the UK, because it will remain a force for good.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't actually think this is a unique phenomenon to Boris Johnson and the current Conservative administration. I think even if you go back to the early 1970s, when the Heath government successfully brought Britain into the European Union, Conservative cabinet ministers at that time were astonished by the negotiating strength and unity of the EU, much as they were even 10 years before de Gaulle's veto. Because once you have an agreed common position articulated and defended by the European Commission, it's very, very difficult for an outside force to break that apart. And so there's really little understanding inside the UK political system of the nature of European integration and the process by which it creates these new interdependencies. Now, that leads me to a further question that I would like to ask you, if I may, is about TTIP. One of the most interesting sections, I think, in your book is where you discuss in some detail the TTIP negotiations and, in a way, ask the question, why did they fail? And I think, if I may say so, I think you're pretty fair in explaining the positions of both sides, and you're quite careful in the way you apportion responsibility and any blame. And you conclude that neither side really recognized that TTIP was, quote, unlike any other prior trade negotiation that they'd ever undertaken, because the parties are of equal size and negotiating leverage, and that neither side was willing to mobilize the necessary political will to get the outcome they wanted. In fact, you're kind of implicitly critical of your boss, President Obama, when you say he did not appear willing to invest sufficient political capital to get TTIP over the line, attaching greater priority to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you say, I privately wondered whether the priorities should not be inverted. So looking back now at why TTIP failed, and if there was an attempt, perhaps in more modest form, but if there was an attempt to revive TTIP under a new administration, what are the lessons and conclusions to be drawn from the previous experience?
Be less ambitious. Even Joe Biden said something I quote in the book, is that his view is that if you're going to be crucified, i.e. crucified because of free trade, you should be crucified on a big cross. Meaning, let's be ambitious, right? But in hindsight, that was not the right thing to do. There are things that we could have done to reduce the controversial elements of what we were trying to do. we almost immediately got stuck into a ridiculous debate, you probably remember, about investor-state dispute settlement. Now, my personal view is that this is a mechanism that we should have in our free trade agreements, but it wasn't worth dying in a ditch over. And pretty soon, that's exactly what we were doing. We were dying in the ditch of a very technical mechanism known previously to probably a handful of arbitration experts. We should have dropped it. We should have gone about other issues in a different way. I talk about geographical indications, where I was extremely annoyed with the approach of the American administration, which I thought misunderstood the cultural sensitivities around this issue, not an economically very significant issue in most member states, but a culturally very significant issue. And we were battling each other, hitting each other on the head regarding agriculture, in the EU, or public procurement in the United States, where we are very closed, both on the federal and sub-federal level. And we were hitting over each other over the heads because we couldn't even agree on the factual point of departure. We would argue to the EU, we're more open to public procurement, here are the figures. And the EU would say, no, we are more open legally and de facto, here are our figures. And we were far, far away from agreeing on the actual state of play. We hit each other on the head over a whole range of other issues. The short answer is there is a lot we can do quickly, pragmatically, to liberalize trade. I mentioned one of them. Eliminate industrial goods tariffs on industrial goods trade. We can focus on regulatory cooperation in areas which are less controversial. We got stuck in the trenches, you probably remember, Anthony, on auto safety rules, which are incredibly technical and difficult for reasons I had to learn about. But they're non-safety standards on autos that are meaningful and probably can get done quickly. We can probably move ahead on harmonizing regulations for future, areas of the future, for example, on autonomous cars, where we haven't written the rules. That's a lot easier than harmonizing existing rules. I was very skeptical, for example, on regulatory coherence, which was this concept that we need to make our rules in the same way. We were basically lecturing the EU, you should have a system that looks like our Administrative Procedure Act, which is not going to happen. I don't think it's very easy to change the way the EU makes its rules. And by the way, the EU internally was already doing a lot to make it more transparent. Yes, it's still opaque. We know the trilogue is still a very opaque system, but I didn't think a free trade agreement was the right mechanism to force the EU to change the way it makes its laws. The bottom line is there's a lot that we can get done quickly.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to pick up another couple of questions, and if there are any final questions, because we're now beginning to run short of time, please submit them straight away, and I'll do my very best to include them. So, following up on the reference just a moment ago to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Jerome Saulnier asks more generally, what is your view of the so-called American pivot to Asia? How real is that? And what are its potential implications for EU-US relations? And then another one on a rather different, but also very timely and sensitive issue from Mario Damon. What options would, and he says the Biden administration, so he's confidently expecting, does the Biden administration, so he's confidently expecting a Biden victory there, have to be softer on Germany in case of Nord Stream sanctions, knowing that the overwhelming majority in Congress has supported them, including the Democrats. So two quite tough questions there.
Well, Nord Stream is an issue that, of course, was around when we were when I was at Post, and the Obama administration, Biden, Amos Hochstein, who was our energy coordinator, had the view that this is a deal that was not good for European solidarity, and had a very large political component, and was one that would really split countries one from another, and would in fact aggravate European dependence on Russian gas. Having said that, I think the tactics of this administration are wrong. not only wrong, but really quite sad to be attacking German politicians, an ally, obviously, even the port, individual people saying that they will be put on lists, as I understand, of sanctions lists. This is not the way an ally treats any ally, and particularly such a long-standing, trusted, valued friend as Germany. So I would hope and expect that will end. The project is close to being completed. I view this as a decision principally, not exclusively, really for Europe to decide. There are many other countries who share our concerns, Poland and others, but it is something that Europe has to decide. And the last thing I'll say about this, the focus really should be on diversification of routes and supply. Hence, all these projects we're seeing in liquefied natural gas terminals. Germany has built, I think, a couple. Some are being discussed. One is built in Lithuania, one in Poland, and others in Croatia. We should be focusing on that to address the issue of European energy dependence, but in a way that's respectful of allies. Look, on the pivot to Asia, I'm really glad this question because it keeps on coming up. Look, of course, we have to spend not only a lot, but increasing attention to Asia, given its economic weight in the world, given what's happening in China. Those trends are likely to continue. But I do not see this as meaning that suddenly we care less or should care less about Europe. My book is, in fact, about this, Anthony. My book is about, look, yes, the US and the EU are declining economically, but together, we actually represent significant economic leverage and political power and regulatory power. And if we actually work together, we can still shape the world. And I believe the Biden administration will look to Europe and particularly the EU as a critical partner. So yes, more attention to Asia for obvious reasons, but doesn't mean we undervalue our European friends.
Very good. Now, my calling of time has generated 4 additional questions, which I'm going to post to you in a moment. But I also want to pick up on something that James Ellis also said in his question earlier on, which was when you were US ambassador to the EU in October 2015, you gave a speech to the College of Europe, which was entitled "The New Transatlantic Agenda 20 years on and 20 years ahead." Now, obviously, if you were to give the same speech now, it would be 25 years on. How many years ahead do you think we have, in effect, to get this right? Is it 4? Is it 8?
Gosh, I think it's much less than 20. I really do. Who knows? The trouble is, and the work that James has done in ESPAS is so important in terms of looking over the horizon. But I worry that kind of work is becoming a luxury, because the world is shifting so quickly. We don't even know what the world will look like in 5 years. Hence, my answer is I'm just thinking about the next 4. I'm just thinking about Election Day and what we can do, not only 4 years, but literally in 2 years. I hate to sound so incredibly unimaginative and unvisionary, but I think literally that's what we're talking about.
Isabel Darther says, as the US has always been a model for democracy and freedom, to what extent having a president like Donald Trump has driven other countries, induced them and encouraged them, driven them to follow his examples? Is this a new pattern of authoritarian democracy? Very interesting. I've just been reading a book called The Strong Men by somebody called Hans Kribbe, who actually works in the city, Brussels, where he draws comparisons between the styles of 4 leaders and puts in the same category Xi and Trump. What's your reading of that? The global tendency towards authoritarian democracy? ?
It's a lot of people are writing books about this. I think Gideon Rachman is maybe writing a book about this as well. But let's remember there are just as many differences as there are similarities between these strongmen. They don't always agree on that much. There are similarities. Let's start with the similarities. For me, Donald Trump is actually acting in a rather Chinese way. And what do I mean by that? He's suddenly saying he doesn't, well, like he doesn't believe in free trade, he believes in managed trade. He believes in keeping data stored in the United States, just like the Chinese want data or Chinese citizens stored in the United States. He is taking steps against judicial and media independence, which is rather Chinese as well. He wouldn't see it this way, but he's acting as a rather Chinese authoritarian leader. But what gives me hope is the following, that yes, we're seeing the emergence of these strong men, but as I mentioned, they're all rather different from one another, and they're not exactly being very successful in banding together to promote a coherent worldview. That's the point. I just have written actually a chapter for a book that's about to come out honoring the work of Lucas Tsoukalis, who's a wonderful professor who got me interested in the EU. And my chapter was, the concept of the West is not yet dead. And the principal reason I argue this is that there is no yet any competing vision. You have these strong men, you have China, but no one else is putting forward a coherent, attractive worldview, right? And I think that worldview that some of them are representing has become even less attractive when you see the consequences. So I'm slightly less gloomy about the ability of all of these puppet dictators to actually band together.
Thank you. Aidan O'Sullivan asks the following question. Do you think a President Biden would make his first overseas trip to Brussels? You remember all the criticism of Obama in this city when I think he visited Europe about 10 times before he actually set foot in Brussels. What do you think the prospects are under President Biden?
Well, I have no idea, but I'd love to see it happen. I know some of us would like to see it happen. I think it's important, not only because of the EU, but because of NATO. It would be an important statement early on in the administration, particularly after the damage that's been done in the US-EU relationship, is an early trip here. And I would love, I'm just speaking personally, I would love to see another Biden speech before the European Parliament. Remember, he addressed the plenary in Strasbourg 2011, if I'm not mistaken, right? It was an important speech. We were fighting for TFTP, which was this important tool. I would like to see another speech, symbolic, saying, we believe in the EU, we believe in European integration, we believe in you as an essential partner. So yes, I would like to see it done.
And an allied question from Frank Debier. The EU cannot be neutral on the issue of the future of NATO. You mentioned Turkey, withdrawal of US troops in Germany, etc. What would be your roadmap to rebuild the Atlantic Alliance? And maybe a visit to Brussels would play an important part of that.
Yes, look, I mean, my book is basically about this, although it focuses on the EU because I'm not a NATO expert, and so I don't claim any expertise. Although I didn't mention the importance of increased EU-NATO cooperation, where we had made some progress, even some significant progress at the Warsaw Summit, I believe, in the last year of the administration. I think there's much more that can be done. But my book is about that in terms of restoring the transatlantic relationship, not just economically, but in the core issues of that are political and have a security dimension.
Thank you. We've had other questions about climate change and trade, but in a way you've already covered those. So I'm just going to, as a wrap-up question, come in on a question from Juan Skinas. He says, thank you, Mr. Gardner, for your talk and for all your work. Thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. Can you share with us your thoughts on tonight's presidential debate?
Hello, Juan. My thoughts on the presidential debate. I think that, this is a tricky one. He's such a hard person to debate. But imagery and the visual elements are going to be so important. Remember how important they were even in the debates with Hillary Clinton, where he was seen by some, I guess, as a rather forceful, charismatic person who was towering over her, literally, from behind her during the debates. And people often are marked by those images. Sometimes, according to some polls, people spend more time looking at the images than listening to the words. What Biden needs to do is to, of course, say the right things, not to make any errors, keep to the script, not go on for too long, which unfortunately sometimes he's capable of doing. But he needs to look and be both presidential and to contradict the suspicions that some people may have that somehow he's a front for the more extreme left-wing Democrats that are lurking out there, because that's very much the narrative that Donald Trump has put out there. That yes, yes, Joe looks like your nice uncle, but behind him are lurking all these crazy commies who are going to take away your guns and take away your money and do all these terrible things, right? So I think if I were suggesting to him, that's number one, look and sound presidential and moderate. And the issue of the police and violence in the United States will come up, no doubt, in these debates. And there he needs to walk a very fine line. Clearly, he needs to sound and be, as he is, pro-law enforcement. These people are concerned about violence in the streets. But he also needs to send out a very clear message, and I know he believes about this, about the fact that race relations in the United States are far from being addressed properly and adequately. And I say this as someone who voted for Obama, believing that he represented a clear break with our troubled past on race relations. And I was proved wrong, along with millions of other people. This is still the beginning of a long journey. And Joe Biden has to say that we need to address the core problem, the ghosts of our past and racism. So if he does that, if he shows himself to be moderate and presidential, I think he'll do very well.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for sharing your time, quite a bit of time, 90 minutes almost, with us to talk about your book and to talk about more generally America's place in the world and particularly transatlantic relations. We really do appreciate this. It's a privilege and a pleasure to have you with us. And Klaus, unfortunately, as you know, had to leave the meeting. He sent me a text in which he basically says apologies for having to do that, but something came up which he had to attend to. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, and I think I can speak on behalf of everybody who was with us, well over 140 people or so who were with us, and 105 are still online, to express our collective appreciation. And before giving you a virtual round of applause, just to mention to everybody who is still online that the EPRS will be organising two events, one before and one after the US presidential election, with political commentators, pollsters, pundits, and so on. The first of which will be on the afternoon our time of Thursday, the 29th of October, so literally just before the election, which is the following Tuesday. And I should point out that the Monday, the 2nd of November, is a public holiday in the European Parliament. So that's on the afternoon of Thursday, the 29th of October, with commentators basically from the United States who will be giving their respective views, and then we'll do something after the event, hopefully when we already know the result, to discuss the implications of this truly historic election. And you have teed us up beautifully, Anthony, if I may say so, to understand some of the key issues which are at stake. So on behalf of everybody, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.